Hello dear students, this is a video related with the nervous system. We are going to discuss a few terms related to the transmission of impulses and transport of certain substances through the nerve fiber. Why I chose this topic is because very often I have seen students misunderstanding these terms or confusing or mixing up the terms, and therefore we will see the comparison between these terms related to the axon, related to the nerve fiber. For instance, what is axonal transport and what is conduction in an axon, or transmission related to the axon, or propagation of impulse through the axon, through the nerve fiber. And further, to complicate the issue, we have these terms which are used: anterograde transport, retrograde transport, bidirectional versus unidirectional transport, orthodromic and antidromic conduction. So let's compare these terms and let's try to understand them so that we have a clarity on this topic. First thing is, let's understand the neuron. The basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system is a neuron. And if you see a typical neuron, it has a nerve cell body. There is a nerve cell body and its extensions all around. Small extensions, the dendrites, and then there is a long axon on one end, which we call as nerve fiber. So axon is the nerve fiber, and mostly the transport of substances or propagation of impulse is thought to be away from the nerve cell body towards the axonal ending. Here is an axonal ending. So this is one direction, and this is said to be the forward direction or onward direction for the propagation of impulse or transport of substances. Now let me first also clarify these two terms: transport versus transmission. If this is an axon, a myelinated axon shown here, let me just make it little enlarged view of this axon. So the enlarged view of the axon will be something like this, with the nerve cell body on one end. Well, take it as a diagrammatic representation: nerve cell body and the axon, an enlarged view. And at the other end, we have the axonal ending. The cytoplasm of this axon is called as exoplasm. And when we say transport of substances, we are referring to the exoplasmic transport. That is, the substances are transported within this exoplasm. One way or the other, we will see that. And when we use the term transmission of impulse or conduction of impulse or propagation of impulse or action potential, we are referring to the membrane transport or impulse going through the membrane. You know, membranes are the excitable structures. So impulse transmission, of course, here there are nodes of Ranvier, so action potentials will be generated over here, and then from node to node, the impulse will be conducted electrotonically, direct flow of charges. So that's first basic differentiation between the two terminologies. So when I say exoplasmic transport, it would mean transport of various substances and materials inside the axon through the exoplasm. And the first two terms, anterograde versus retrograde, these two terms are used for this kind of axonal transport. Transport of materials, transport of substances within the exoplasm. So the first two terms are reserved for that exoplasmic transport. Let me add one sentence in this. The exoplasmic transport is carried out with the help of some molecular motors. There are microtubule based motors, and those motors are responsible for carrying out this transport. Microtubules are the filamentous structures, and they form these motors. So the cargo is transported from one end to the other, from the cell body to the axonal ending, or in the opposite. It's carried out by these microtubule based motors. There are two motors actually, commonly known ones. These are kinesin and dynein. So when the substances are being transported in a plus direction, it would be called as anterograde exoplasmic transport. Anterograde transport. Okay, look, you must have understood by now that when we are referring to these terms, it is essentially the direction that we are talking about. Okay, so when we say anterograde transport, it's from the, away from the cell body towards the axonal ending. That's anterograde transport. So kinesin is the microtubule based motor which is involved in the anterograde transport. Kinesin would be the part of that motor which is carrying the cargo. We will also see the examples of these transports and transmissions and conductions. For example, in this case, anterograde exoplasmic transport of various substances, for instance, nutrients, nutritional materials from the cell body toward the terminal, axonal terminal, toward the nerve fiber terminal, mitochondria. So such materials which are synthesized in the nerve cell body are then taken all the way down the axon, and it will be called as anterograde transport. So this is taken to be the straight direction, correct direction, or plus end. Whereas retrograde exoplasmic transport or axonal transport, the molecular motor or the microtubule based motor involved is dynein, and it goes in the opposite. It goes in the opposite direction. So minus end. It's going towards the minus end, or from the terminal. I'm just showing the direction outside the axon with the help of arrows. It's actually within the exoplasm. We are talking about the exoplasmic transport. So if it goes like this, it's going in the reverse, and it's called as retrograde axonal transport. Let's take the example of retrograde axonal transport, and the well-known example is that of tetanus. You know, tetanus is the disease caused by Clostridium tetani bacillus, and either the bacillus or its toxin is responsible for the manifestations of tetanus in the form of excessive muscle contractions. If there is an excessive spasm of masseter resulting in lockjaw, or laryngospasm, the commonest, the deadliest manifestation of tetanus, the laryngospasm. So the basic feature of tetanus, why it is fatal, is because of the excessive muscle contractions, laryngospasm or lockjaw or such. Let's see why there are these excessive muscle contractions, spasmodic contractions, and what is involved in that is the retrograde axonal transport. So let's try to understand this retrograde axonal transport. You know, generally, this is of almost a common knowledge that when there is an injury to some body part and there is a wound, and if that wound is dirty, unclean, then it has a potential to cause tetanus, and therefore tetanus toxoid or anti-tetanus serum is given. So how does that happen? Why this is going to cause excess contraction? It is because of the retrograde transport, as we said. Let's say here is a muscle and a person suffers from injury. So here is a muscle. Of course, we are talking about the skeletal muscle. And here is a neuromuscular junction. The neuromuscular junction. This is a motor neuron coming from the spinal cord and ending on this muscle. So basically, this is the axonal ending which we were referring to some time back. And here is this motor neuron. So let's show the spinal cord and what all things are responsible for this retrograde transport and symptoms, manifestations of tetanus. Here is the spinal cord. Here is the spinal cord, and now listen to this part carefully. Let's say there was an injury, a wound was created, and it's a dirty wound, an unclean type of wound. So tetanus bacillus gains entry into the body, into the muscle via that wound. Tetanus bacillus is also known to produce the toxin. So either we are talking about the tetanus bacillus or the toxin. It has gained entry into the muscle. Next thing, now look at the transport and the direction of the transport. See, this is a motor neuron coming from the spinal cord. So, and nerve cell body, let's say located here, the anterior horn of the spinal cord, anterior motor neuron as we refer to this. Normally, impulse would be carried like this from the spinal cord. So this is the direction, a normal anterograde direction, either impulse or the exoplasmic transport away from the nerve cell body. But in this case, what is going to happen is this toxin, the bacillus or the toxin, it is going to go in the reverse. Look, this is a neuromuscular junction, and impulse is expected to travel like this from the nerve to the muscle. But now it's this particular bacillus, the tetanus, is going in the opposite direction. Once it gains the entry into this motor neuron, then it is transported in a retrograde fashion. Yes, that is what we are looking at right now, the retrograde axonal transport. So it travels in a retrograde fashion and reaches the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, in the anterior horn, there is this nerve cell body. So what is to be understood further is that there are interneurons in the spinal cord. Interneurons have generally the small extensions, small axons. So here is an interneuron which is ending on the nerve cell body of this motor neuron, which is going to send impulses, signals to the muscle for the sake of contraction. Now this interneuron is an inhibitory interneuron in the spinal cord. Inhibitory interneuron, what is the function? What is the role? It keeps the activity of the motor neuron in check. It has an inhibitory control on the motor neuron activity. So just an example, okay, just a hypothetical example. If this motor neuron was expected to send 100 impulses to the muscle, Then under the influence of this inhibitory interneuron, maybe 50 or 60 impulses will be sent and will reach the muscle. So that's the function of this inhibitory interneuron. And you know, inhibitory transmitters are GABA and glycine. To be more precise, glycine is the commonest inhibitory interneuron in the spinal cord. So glycine mainly, but also GABA at some places. This inhibitory interneuron releases GABA or glycine on the motor nerve cell, motor neuron. Now see what is happening. The tetanus bacillus or its toxin has traveled like this in a retrograde fashion. It reaches the spinal cord and now it further is traveling and entering this inhibitory interneuron. Rather, I would say the nerve ending of this inhibitory interneuron. It's the presynaptic ending. Once it enters there, it attaches to the gangliosides and thereby stops the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters. If inhibitory neurotransmitters are not released now because of this, because of the tetanus bacillus, what is going to happen? Motor neuron activity cannot be kept in check now, and therefore there will be excessive signaling from the motor neuron going to the skeletal muscle, resulting in excessive spasmodic contraction of the skeletal muscle that gets manifested in the form of the various manifestations which I said just now, the lockjaw, the laryngospasm, and so on and so forth. So that's the mechanism of action of tetanus bacillus. But the point that we were referring to was the retrograde axonal transport. It went all the way up to the nerve cell body in the spinal cord, and from there it further went in the opposite direction. This inhibitory interneuron was supposed to keep a check. Now that will be lifted because the inhibitory neurotransmitter or their release will be inhibited, stopped by this particular, tetanus bacillus or its toxin. That's the action of tetanus, but look at the transport, retrograde axonal transport. So we have seen the first two terms and they were related to the axonal transport which occurs through the exoplasm. Now we will look at the remaining terms. And the terms are, let's begin with these two: bidirectional versus unidirectional. Okay, let me clarify again. The remaining four terms are related to the impulse transmission. Okay, and impulse transmission is the membrane excitation. So axonal membrane is going to excite primarily. It's not like the first two terms where there was transport through the exoplasm. Well, there is flow of ions through the exoplasm in these cases also, but let's have this differentiating feature that the first two terms were transport of various materials, whereas now the remaining terms are related to the impulse transmission or impulse conduction or impulse propagation. So please remember, conduction, transmission, propagation, these terms are used for impulse, and transport is for transport of materials. Coming to the terms, bidirectional versus unidirectional. Let's draw a nerve fiber. We had drawn the nerve fiber just now for understanding the transport of substances. Now this is a nerve fiber, this is an axon, and imagine this, that I stimulate this nerve fiber in the middle. Look, this is hypothetical, this is experimental. In reality, it does not happen like this. When you stimulate a nerve fiber, generally it is at the starting point. For example, if you are stimulating a sensory neuron in the skin, the stimulus is applied at the starting point, and from there the impulses will go all the way to the cortex. Or motor neurons, firing will begin at the starting point in the motor cortex and then it will come down to the muscles. So that's a normal thing that happens. This is hypothetical or experimental. Let's say experimentally we have stimulated this nerve fiber bang in the middle. What will we expect? What do you expect to happen? Impulses can go in either direction because this nerve fiber was resting so far at minus 70 millivolts. Now you have applied the stimulus in the middle and sodium channels are present all along the nerve fiber membrane. So impulse can travel hypothetically, theoretically, because this is a theoretical situation that we are looking at, the impulse can travel in both directions, okay? And therefore, we can say a neuron, or more precisely the axon, nerve fiber, a nerve fiber can conduct the impulse bidirectionally. A nerve fiber, an axon, can conduct the impulse bidirectionally if it is stimulated in the middle, hypothetically. But when the impulse reaches the nerve ending, then there is a synapse. So here is a synapse. Impulse will be transferred from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. Look, this is a diagrammatic representation, okay? I have said just now that membrane excites. So impulse generally is transmitted through the membrane. So that's how you can differentiate between an exoplasmic transport. Let me make it clear once again that even the ions which are getting transmitted for the propagation of impulse, there is some amount of exoplasm involved in that also, but just differentiate between the transport of materials and transmission of impulse. That is why I am clarifying it again and again and again. Okay, now coming to the synapse. At the synapse, there has to be unidirectional flow of impulse, unidirectional transmission of impulse, okay? So let me just summarize. A neuron, a nerve fiber can conduct the impulse bidirectionally, hypothetically, theoretically, experimentally. But a synapse will always conduct the impulse in a unidirectional fashion from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. And why is that? Reason is very obvious, because the neurotransmitter is located, the neurotransmitter vesicles are located in the presynaptic terminal, and its receptors, the neurotransmitter receptors, are located on the postsynaptic membrane, and therefore impulse in a synapse has to travel in a unidirectional manner from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic neuron. Therefore, that is the terminology that can be used. Now coming to the last pair of terms, orthodromic versus antidromic. Look, just now we've seen that in a nerve fiber, if you stimulated that nerve fiber in the middle, then the impulse can go in both the directions, and therefore we use the term bidirectional. But it has to be seen in a very limited context. You know why? Because now see this, orthodromic. Once the impulse takes a certain direction, once the impulse took a certain direction, we have simulated it in the middle, it took a certain direction, then it cannot go back and excite the previous area. It will go on in an onward straight fashion. Okay, so when I said bidirectional, it had a very limited context that it can be conducted bidirectionally in both directions. But once it takes a certain direction, the impulse, once it starts traveling in a certain direction, then it cannot come back. I mean, bidirectional does not mean that way. Okay, so let that point be very, very clear. Because see, it's quite obvious that the impulse has started traveling in a certain direction. The next point is resting, will be resting, okay, and the previous point will be in the refractory state. So impulse cannot go back and excite the previous area. So it cannot be bidirectional in that sense. So bidirectional should be seen only in the limited context. So when the impulse took a certain direction, then it travels in an onward straight fashion. It cannot come back. That is one way which we can call orthodromic conduction. Orthodromic has another meaning as well. We will see that just now. But orthodromic, ortho means straight. So orthodromic conduction means an onward straight conduction of impulse. It cannot go back to excite the previous area. It will go onward direction only. Once it has taken one direction, it will go straight in that direction. It cannot come back. So that's one meaning of orthodromic conduction. Otherwise, we can also say orthodromic conduction means, suppose I stimulate a sensory neuron in the skin. Impulses start from that first point. Now look, this is an afferent neuron. Afferent neuron means what? It starts from the periphery and conducts the impulse to the center, to the spinal cord. So the impulse will be carried from the periphery to the center. This is also another meaning for orthodromic conduction. In an afferent neuron, you know the afferent means periphery to center. So in an afferent neuron, when it is stimulated, the impulses are carried from the periphery, from the skin to the spinal cord, and that also is referred to as orthodromic conduction, the way it should be, straight direction. Then what is antidromic conduction? I mean, then you might have understood by now that antidromic would be in the opposite direction, means that in an afferent nerve fiber, in an afferent neuron, if the impulse goes in the opposite direction, towards the skin, from center to the skin, in that direction, opposite, then it would be called as antidromic conduction. Yes, then it would be called as antidromic conduction. And let's check the example of this antidromic conduction. It is typically said to be occurring in triple reaction or triple response seen in the context of cutaneous circulation. When you stimulate an area of the skin firmly, when you stroke the area, that particular area firmly in a very strong manner, then you see three reactions, and therefore it's called as triple response. And these three things that happen, they are red reaction that happens within a few seconds, let's say within 10 seconds or so, and then wheel and flare, or flare and wheel. Now flare is said to be occurring due to the antidromic conduction. Okay, so I stimulate an area of the skin. First, there will be a red line in that region. That's a red reaction. But then that redness will spread in the adjoining areas. Look, when the red line happened initially, it was along the line of stimulus. Fine. But then that redness spreads. It's like a flare up. And that flare or spreading of that redness is because of the antidromic conduction. Let's try to understand this antidromic conduction in the context of this flare which happens in the triple response. Let's say here is an area of skin, and I'm going to excite or stimulate this area of the skin. So now what is going to happen is, here is a neuron shown in the blue color. Here is a cutaneous sensory neuron. All right. There are the branches. These are the branches. And this area of the skin was stimulated. Here is a firm line or stimulus applied to this area of the skin. What happens next? Sensory neuron, this branch will conduct the impulse. Fine? Okay. Impulse is conducted, but from the branching point, see, these are all branches of that neuron, and this is now going towards the spinal cord. Obviously, it's an afferent neuron, so impulses will be carried to the spinal cord. Stimulus applied over here, this part of the skin, and now impulses are traveling. Okay, they will go all the way to the spinal cord, that's fine, and that would be called as orthodromic conduction. Ortho, straight, the way it has to be. In the case of an afferent neuron, from periphery to the center, yes, orthodromic. But from the branching point, the impulses can come down like this. Look, this is an afferent neuron. It is expected to carry the impulses like this from the periphery to the center, to the spinal cord. But look at this, what is happening? You stimulated this area, impulses traveled up to the branching point, impulses also went up to the spinal cord. That's an orthodromic conduction. But then the impulses came down in the reverse direction. Can you note that? Afferent neuron, but impulse is coming toward the skin, coming back to the skin, or in the opposite direction. So this would be called as antidromic conduction, which is happening in the other branches of that sensory neuron. This is an antidromic conduction. What happens then is that there are arterioles which are being innervated by these branches. There are arterioles in the area which are innervated by those three other branches. This is a diagrammatic representation. So what happens is now arteriolar dilation and increased blood flow, and that redness will spread or flare up. Flare up, I'm just using the term in a conventional manner, flare up or spread. So that is antidromic conduction in the other three branches. Well, this is also said to be because of the axon reflex. So I'm just adding one more term. This triple response and the flare is said to be because of the so-called axon reflex. So keep that term also in mind. Right. So these were the terms and their comparison in the context of how the things are carried in the exoplasm. Just to clarify for one more time, I said transport of substances or materials within the exoplasm. So that's transport. And impulse transmission is along the membrane, but the charges, they do flow to some extent within the exoplasm as well. So it's not a very clear-cut distinction. Well, yes, charges do flow in the exoplasm as well. If you just got confused that how come just membrane is getting excited, no, charges do come in the exoplasm as well. But clarify this point: transport of substances, transmission or conduction or propagation is that of impulse. And these were the terms that are used in the context of axonal transport and transmission.